Hello, this is America and this is Florida, a state that gets hit by more hurricanes than any other in the country. Now, scientific research is crucial for working out how and where those weather systems are going to form and where the hurricanes are likely to hit. But the Trump administration's cuts to major research hubs has alarmed scientists around the world. We're going to have more on that shortly from Florida, but first to Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Phil. Since America's founding, scientists here have made discoveries that have changed the world. Benjamin Franklin harnessing electricity, Alexander Graham Bell inventing the telephone, Jonas Salk discovering a vaccine for polio. But now, the next generation of research is under threat. The Trump administration has pulled or threatened to withdraw billions of dollars in funding for hundreds of science and research programs that benefit people all across the world.
Explain why the administration wants to cut so much from cancer research.
The Trump administration has been ordered to restore hundreds of research grants related to diversity.
The Trump administration is facing scrutiny for slashing jobs at the National Weather Service.
For generations, federal research funding to universities has fueled breakthroughs in medicine, technology, and national defense.
Those proposed cuts to science funding would be worth billions of dollars. But where exactly is that funding being pulled from? Alex Baird has been digging into the numbers to find out.
To get a real sense of just how big those cuts are, let's dig into the president's budget request for the next financial year, and it's bad news for NASA. The overall budget cut by nearly a quarter, even worse news for their science budget, and that means more than 50 science missions cancelled. Now, don't forget, the president is pushing to get American astronauts back to the moon by 2028. Meanwhile, over at the Science Foundation, it's even rougher. Overall budget slashed by more than half. The SBE directorate eliminated. But why does that matter? Well, they fund nearly 2/3 of all academic research into the social and psychological sciences in this country. But the science cuts go a lot wider than that. We're talking $33.7 billion wiped from science funding across the board. Now, what does that number look like in practice? Well, we're going to have to jump off the stage to give those cuts some room. These are all the different departments and agencies on the chopping block. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, 54%. The Environmental Protection Agency, 52%. The Agency for Transformative Biomedical and Health Research, cut by more than a third. And the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, gone. Now, the White House has said that all of those proposed cuts are critical to managing US national debt, but the Union for Concerned Scientists says that's a hard sell when the Department of Defense is getting a budget bump of $445 billion.
Now, the Trump administration has justified its efforts to change federal funding for science and research programs as necessary to protect the public purse. But critics call the White House's efforts an attack on basic knowledge and on best practices, an attack that they claim will harm tens of millions of Americans. And of course, its impact is being felt far beyond U.S. borders. Rosalind Jordan reports.
And liftoff.
Space travel, the internet, GPS, saving lives, the food supply, the environment. The result of 80 years of U.S. research spending, bringing some U.S. researchers the Nobel Prize.
Should you tell them how many years ago it was?
Well, about 40 years ago.
It's pretty good. Yeah. And you still look good.
Thank you.
Great job. I've been waiting for one of them, too.
By 2028, President Donald Trump wants to beat China by building the world's first quantum computer, the next generation of supercomputers. At the same time, he wants to cut billions of dollars in research, specifically targeting so-called woke areas that address minority and gender issues. Trump's efforts have landed him in court against leading schools such as Harvard and the University of California. He accused them of being too liberal and anti-Semitic. Lawmakers have problems with Trump's plans.
A reading from the director of a consortium of research universities, he says your budget cuts are the equivalent of working in a company that feels like it's on the verge of bankruptcy.
Our view is that we want to make sure that there's a dollar that's actually well spent on research.
Thank you very much.
We're here at the Smithsonian Institution, a testament to American ingenuity. It's a good place to remember that Donald Trump isn't the first U.S. president to try to cut funding for science. In 1973, Richard Nixon fired the head of the National Institutes of Health over cancer research priorities. A few years later, a bad economy forced budget cuts at the National Science Foundation.
Liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket.
The Trump administration is keen on private-public partnerships to advance his priorities, including AI and the U.S. space program. No matter what, research funding is essential, whether to
is making space more accessible,
expand 3D printing, or improve transportation options. The question is whether Trump's 2027 budget can stretch far enough to pay for what he calls gold standard science, and whether cutting funds for American research would deplete global scientific knowledge. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
We are joined now by Stephen Morrison, who is the Senior Vice President and Director of the Global Health Policy Center at CSIS, and by Stephen Ezell, the Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Stephen and Stephen, thank you both for coming in today. We have lots to discuss. A lot of these proposed cuts are across the board when it comes to science, technology, all kinds of research, climate efforts to fight climate change, I should say. But Stephen Ezell, let's start with the big picture. In your view, how dramatic have the proposed Trump administration cuts been? And how successful have they been in their eyes, their intention versus what has actually happened?
Well, the proposed cuts to science funding have been very significant. Last year, FY 2026, the Trump administration proposed 40% cuts to the National Institutes of Health, 54% cut in FY 2027 to the National Science Foundation, 46% cuts to NASA's science research, significant cuts at DOE as well. So the budget request include a lot of significant cuts. Now, when we look last year, what we saw is that Congress kept NIH funding almost 100% of what it had been the prior year, at about $48 billion. So thus far, there has been significant pushback in Congress to these science research funding cuts. And I would expect the appropriations in the year ahead will push back on some of the most extensive of these science cuts.
So the most dramatic things that we've seen essentially are the proposals. Congress, Stephen Morrison, and the courts have done a pretty good job at pushing back against this dramatic slashing.
Yes, but it's created enormous uncertainty in our academic research institutions, and it's been accompanied by major changes in major institutions. We'll talk a little bit about CDC later, but NIH, FDA, CDC, NSF, they've all been subjected to major slashes in their employment base and in their programming, and there's been great uncertainty around what the future is. And you've had a larger assault upon American major universities that are R&D high performers. And if you go to any major university in the United States today and ask what is going on, you'll hear things like, well, we admitted 90 PhD students into the School of Public Health at Hopkins last year. We admitted 30 this year. We admitted 430 master's students. We're down to 275. The foreign student inflow has dropped dramatically. We're also seeing an exodus of senior foreign talent from the scientific domains within our universities. So it's not just budgets. It's not just suggested budgets that then are protected by congressional action. It's part of a larger rupture of the university system and of the scientific enterprise, involving damage to our major institutions and to our and uncertainty within the academic setting.
And one thing you didn't mention was also immigration that is paired with everything that you just mentioned, in that there's an increasingly hostile environment in this country when it comes to accepting foreigners and getting visas. Stephen Ezell, when other countries, adversaries, China and others, see this happening here, what's their reaction and what efforts are they undertaking to grab those students, to grab those researchers, because they still are funding a lot of this kind of research?
I think other countries see significant opportunity both to attract American researchers who may look for better opportunities abroad. And when you look at national adversaries like China, I think they view it as a significant opportunity for them to get a leg up in international, technological competition. In 2024, for the first time ever, China surpassed the United States in aggregate funding of research and development, 1.03 trillion to 1.01 trillion. That hasn't happened since World War II. Last year, China graduated 50% more STEM PhD students than we did, as doctorate students out of their universities. So from research to scientists and engineers to talent, China is increasingly speeding ahead of the United States. But even in our allied countries, there's an initiative now called Choose Europe for Science, where they have poached hundreds and hundreds of U.S. scientists who now, if there's uncertain funding for their labs or their research, they move abroad. A study by Nature magazine last February of 1,600 U.S. scientists and researchers found that 75% were considering moving abroad. So, as Stephen says, the potential damage that these cuts and this uncertainty can do to the American science enterprise is massive.
That's extraordinary, and not just at the younger age groups that are coming to university, as you point out, but the more established researchers as well.
And if I may,
please.
Just our country's investment in R&D is the seed corn of the jobs, the occupations, and the industries of the future. If you just look at federal funding of university R&D and kind of the academic technology transfer that it engenders, since 1996, we have had 21,000 startup companies being spun out of U.S. universities, supported by 160,000 patents. And companies everyone knows, Google, Genentech, Cisco, these are all companies that can trace their start back to federal funding of R&D.
So it's one thing to have an administration that's relatively anti-science, as the critics would allege, but they, of course, claim the mantle of being pro-business. So how is there any justification for these kinds of cuts?
Well, you're pointing to a central tension or contradiction in the administration's approach. On the one hand, they see the scientific enterprise as woke, as overwhelmingly democratic in orientation, as insular and entitled, as bloated, as engaging in old types of science versus new types of science, and they're trying to correct that. There's an element of retribution. There's the COVID experience feeds into much of this debate, and the focus on indirect costs, which have become very, very steep in many major research universities, the reproducibility of results. Those are huge themes as part of this critique.
Right.
And there's some legitimacy in these arguments, but they've been carried to extreme. And the counter argument within the administration is it's taking a geostrategic approach to biotech and biopharma now, right? It's looking at those sectors and saying, these now bear comparison to critical minerals or to microchips. We need an industrial policy. We need to be preserving our competitiveness. This gets to what Steve was saying, which is science is fundamental to U.S. prosperity, global competitiveness, and leadership, and to national security. And that argument is being made by one arm of the administration. We have another, which is led by, in this instance, by OMB, which is trying also to shrink the fiscal responsibilities to support science because it's part of a broader objective. But there is this animus against science that is very puzzling in a way. It's shared widely, but the polling that's done by the major polling shows pretty strong, enduring support among the American public for investing in science. So I don't think they're winning the argument so much with the American people about the value and merit of doing this.
Let's drill down, if you don't mind, Mr. Ezell, into health specifically. Before we get into that, I just want to give our viewers some numbers. And I know that we're throwing a lot of numbers around today, but they are very important to understand when it comes to the proposed health cuts. If we could pull that graphic up. This is going to be a major restructuring of the Health and Human Services Department. That's what's been proposed, slashing of its budget of about about 12.5%. A couple more numbers to take stock of. More than $500 million would be cut from maternal and child health across the country. Nearly $1 billion removed for HIV and AIDS education and prevention. $872 million will be removed from the federal health care workforce programs affecting the training and recruitment of doctors and nurses. And then more than $500 million will also be cut to mental health services, which include suicide prevention, substance abuse, and to treatment. So, Stephen Ezell, you were about to make the point, but I want to ask you the question that, as you mentioned, this is an economic driver. So when you see those cuts in healthcare, in health research, how much is the U.S. losing its competitive edge?
Well, I want to pick up on Stephen's conversation about how the administration responds to science and federal funding of science. Because it's not just the anti-wokeism. It's also that there are those on the free market right who believe that when the government invests in research, it crowds out private sector investment. So the Mercatus Center recently wrote a paper which said that if we cut federal R&D and funding, this will actually be good for long-term technological progress. And that's just wrong on the facts. Historical evidence shows that for every $1 of federal funding of R&D, it leads to up to $15 to $20 of social benefit to our economy. If you just look in healthcare at NIH funding, every $1 of federal funding for the NIH delivers $2.50 of short-term economic impact and long-term $8.30. So they're wrong on the facts when they don't see the linkage between federal investment in R&D and the social and economic benefits it brings for our society. And this would be why cuts in particular to health sciences are so dangerous. You look at the Human Genome Project, you look at mRNA vaccines, you look at lipid nanoparticle delivery systems that were key for the vaccines, CRISPR-Cas gene editing, chemo antigen therapies for cancer treatment. All of this comes out of federal funding for basic scientific research that discovers new insights into chemistry and biology that are the platform then that we innovate new biomedical discoveries on top of. And if we lose that, we undermine the entire innovation system that we have supporting America's world-leading life sciences innovation system, and then all the downstream economic and social benefits that comes from that. Yeah. And just lastly, on what you showed in those cuts, why at this point in time, when we already have a national crisis with insufficient numbers of doctors and nurses, why would we be cutting training funding for that?
Well, one of the people whose name has been most associated with these cuts and the turmoil within the healthcare industry and the health sector in general is RFK Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And there was an interview over the weekend with a former senior official from the CDC. I want to play a little bit of that interview, and we'll discuss it on the other side. Take a listen.
I think the Secretary has caused a lot of irreparable harm. And when you look at many of the polls out there, the trust in public health, specifically CDC, has decreased dramatically, over 20 points in many polls. That's really difficult to recover from. And when states are removing links to the CDC website and following other medical organizations, I don't know how you build back that trust overnight.
Stephen Morrison, what do you make of her assessment of what's going on at the CDC?
What Deborah's referring to specifically is that RFK Jr. Has dismantled the vaccine infrastructure, the ecosystem that oversees and manages vaccines, particularly this one review committee, the ACIP, right. And he has summarily shrunk the regimen of childhood vaccines from 17 to 5, and he's taken a bunch of other steps that have further warped the credibility of CDC as a source, as a gold standard source on the science in that area. And CDC's also suffered massive retrenchment of its senior talent. And it's very demoralized, and it's in probably the most acute state it's ever been in. And the currently NIH head Jay Bhattacharya has been named to oversee CDC. Erica Schwartz, a career official, has been nominated to be the next director, and hopefully we'll see her up in the Senate this month or later. The CDC has not had a director in the entire term of the second Trump administration, except for 29 days when The director was serving and then fired by RFK. So it's been without leadership. Deborah and three other senior leaders resigned at the same point in which the director was fired, and others have been dismissed or taken retirement. And so it is a crisis within CDC, and I agree with what Deborah says. It's going to take a lot to get back, but what's most important is building a bipartisan vision for bringing it back.
There's also been a crisis of confidence, as you mentioned, when it comes to the CDC, which so many people look to as a source of information, not just CDC at a federal level, but also the state and local health agencies as well. I want to discuss cuts that are also being done in the climate sector. We have a report from our Phil Lavelle, and I want to discuss with you some of these other profound cuts. But Phil is in Florida, which gets hit by more hurricanes than any other state. We are now a month into the annual hurricane season, but forecasters nearly had to go without access to crucial data that predicts everything from how violent storms will be to whether earthquakes will generate a tsunami. And that's because the globally used ocean monitoring system that had been earmarked to be shut down by the Trump administration. The decision was reversed after a widespread outcry from politicians on both sides of the aisle, as well as from ocean experts. Phil Lavelle has more from just outside Fort Lauderdale.
Florida looks idyllic, but that can change within hours. Life-threatening hurricanes are never far away. We are a month into the annual hurricane season now, with forecasters and scientists scanning patterns 24/7 for 6 long months. And the eyes and ears that help them predict those storms largely down there, deep beneath the waves. A network of 900 high-tech underwater sensors, plus drones and buoys scattered along both coasts. $368 million worth. And an attempt to shut them down during a super El Nino summer, no less, just caused a different type of storm up in Washington, D.C. The OOI stands for Ocean Observatories Initiative. Big name and big role. It's open access to scientists around the world, giving them crucial data on ocean changes and environmental events. It was quietly targeted last month by the Trump administration. There was no big announcement, just a small mention on a federal website describing it as a de-scoping, but enough to catch the eyes of both Democrats and Republicans, both sides outraged enough that the White House quietly U-turned. The administration has been gradually cutting research grants to bodies studying climate change for the last 18 months. But the decision to scrap these sensors was even more controversial because they are used for so much more. And the threat of a data blackout caused panic globally. They help detect tsunamis by tracking underwater earthquakes and volcanic activity. Secure the internet too, preventing deep-sea mudslides from snapping the fiber optic cables which carry 95% of the world's internet traffic. Plus protect food supplies, monitoring fish migrations so commercial fleets can fish sustainably. And help with sea rescues by feeding real-time drift models to coast guards during accidents. The hurricane hunter planes that fly into the eye of a storm rely on this deep sea grid too. Airborne crews can measure surface heat, but without those seafloor sensors, they can't predict if a hurricane will violently explode overnight. The administration has spent months targeting conservation, climate science, and green energy.
Whatever the hell happens, this climate change, it's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
But in the ocean, the invisible sensors are safe, at least for now. Phil Lavelle, Al Jazeera, near Fort Lauderdale in Florida.
Stephen Morrison, when you have a president there talking about how essentially the fight against climate change is a con job, how much is the U.S. falling behind other countries when it comes to this battle?
It's shocking what's happened in the last 18 months. There's been a wholesale dismantling of our own institutional capabilities, and we've just had the story on one very vitally important one. There's many others that have been dismantled. We've withdrawn from the global process of deliberations. We've ceased trying to leverage our relationship with China to bring about and drive forward further changes. Without the U.S. at the table joining in that fashion, we're in a period of stall. We have leverage also among our Arab allies and the like, and we had leverage with our European allies. Those alliances have dissipated, and we are alone. and very much standing alone and having dismantled both our domestic and our global capabilities.
And Stephen Ezell, we just have a minute left, but this is also an opportunity to develop new technologies around what could help us fight climate change. Is the U.S. making nearly enough of an effort in that space?
Not at all. So it's not just that we're behind in climate science. It's also that we're behind in technological climate innovations, right? So if you look at China last year, they accounted for 62% of the world's EV cars and 77% of the batteries. That's an industry that we risk losing almost entirely. We've already lost solar panels. We've lost wind turbines. We're losing now to nuclear power in China. If we take a kind of militant point of view of any anti-climate technology, that's going to have a lot of negative spillover effects on U.S. competitiveness. And make no mistake, the U.S. auto industry is under serious threat right now from Chinese competition.
Yeah, we really are seeing it, and you see it in a very significant way in the solar space, where the Chinese are just leaping ahead.
The U.S. produces 1% of the world's solar panels, 6% of the world's wind turbines, China over 70% in both. And we, in America, we created those technologies, right? But we lost them, as we have in so many sectors, to Asia and China in particular.
Gentlemen, you paint a very dire picture, but thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. Stephen Morrison from CSIS, Stephen Ezell from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. That's all from the team here in Washington, D.C. Handing back to Phil Lavelle and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, and don't forget, you can catch This Is America every weekday, Monday to Friday, 18:30 GMT, or if you're here in the United States, that is 2:30 p.m. on the East Coast. That's it for this edition. We'll see you again soon. Bye for now.